I did say, though, that there was the question which arose in this Hyde Park offshoot, Hyde Park spillover, this Stratford mayhem of slavery, again in relation to the question of race. So I'll just go and find that, and I'll pause for a moment, and you won't have time to get a cup of tea, but nonetheless.
But slavery was done by the Arabs and the English, the white race.
The Arabs was worse.
Slavery was endemic in the Old Testament as well.
Just a pause there. The gentleman said that slavery was done by the Arabs and the English, the white people. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but in fact it's very important, I think, for black people to know that it wasn't a matter of, say, British sailors or British Royal Marines landing on the West African coast and racing into the interior, fixed bayonets and capturing Africans and then dragging them back to the seashore and onto ships, then off to the Caribbean or North America. This was business. African chiefs who would, for untold ages, enslave other Africans for various reasons, and perhaps traded them with other tribes that were also powerful. They would, once the whites came on the scene, trade with them. Trade with them in human capital. In fact, Mansa Musa, a famed hero in a kind of silly version of black history, he was hugely wealthy, but his wealth was built on slavery. It's not unusual, it's common in human affairs. But we just have to understand, African people were as complicit in the slave trade as were white people. It's just that nations like Great Britain stopped it. And so I'm going to let this video roll a bit more. But I just think there's no emphasis on this. And I think the people who educate the populace are deliberately fostering tension between racial groups by not being honest about the past. One must not think of African people in Africa seeing themselves as all brothers before the whites came and then facing the whites as brothers. No, there was all kinds of mayhem going on there. There's a particular group racially called Bantu that were originated in West Africa, and they now are everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa because they moved by conquest. And it wasn't pretty. It took centuries to get from West Africa to the southern African coast, to the Cape of Good Hope. It's violence, but violence against what you might call their fellow Africans. But it's just the human way. And so to think that an African would not sell another African to a white man is to misunderstand the nature of human beings. The chiefs were not seeing these people as their fellows. The tribe was your community. And so, given that you were making money off other tribes by capturing them and using them as slaves yourself, why should you not sell them to white people? So we have complicity. Black chieftains, white Europeans, Arabs. All right, just having cleared that up, we'll resume the video.
The Arabs was worse.
Slavery was endemic in the Old Testament as well. It was referred to in historical terms.
Did not Islam enslave black people?
Of course.
Not Islam. Let me.
Just have to stop that there. Did Islam not enslave black people? Not Islam, Mustafa says. Well, that's interesting, really. Because, let's just see if we can bring up some useful information here about Islam. And this is, just get it on here. There we are. Now, this is from a book by a man called Jonathan A.C. Brown, who is a Muslim convert, an academic, and he wrote a book called Islam and Slavery. And this is a few little highlights of it. Too much to go through. The largest number of slaves, as you can see written here on the right, the largest number of slaves brought into the Islamic world almost certainly came from Africa, because they had other zones they were getting them from Eastern Europe, for example. But this massive influx of slaves from Africa, they didn't accidentally end up in the Islamic world. They were brought there by Muslims for Muslims. So what Mustafa's saying in Stratford there, I just do not know. You can say, look further. Now, you know the Atlantic slave trade began a few centuries ago and ended way back in the 19th century, early 19th century. But look at this. Over 12 and a half centuries, between 6 and 7 million black Africans were transported as slaves across the Sahara. That's just that route. There were others from other routes, and there were non-Africans, as I mentioned, say from Eastern Europe, all to feed the desire for slaves of the Islamic Empire. The conditions that they underwent in that transport were quite brutal. Let me just see if I can got something here. No, actually, I'll come to that subsequently, perhaps. Let's return to the video. So you see, to say that Islam didn't do the enslaving. Of course, Islam's a concept, but you know, he's trying to say somehow it wasn't anything to do with Islam, really. He couldn't really answer the gentleman with a straight answer, because he's embarrassed by it. It's a fact of his religion. This is what they did. And mark you, they were far more brutal than even the Atlantic slave trade. Castration, but double castration as well, which would lead to a lot of people losing their lives. That was the fate of the African man when he fell into the hands of the Muslim slave trader. Let's resume.
Let me, can I you asked me a question.
In black slaves?
Didn't Muhammad trade?
In order to free them. Bilal, the first Muslim. Right, let me come to that.
Okay, we had to stop there because this is really misleading to say. It's actually a bit absurd to say Muhammad got slaves in order to free them. You don't do that. Well, you could do that, but Muhammad didn't do that. He was in business. He didn't just buy these slaves and then let them go. He traded slaves. Mustafa mentioned Bilal. Bilal was not freed by Muhammad. He was not freed by Muhammad. Could have done, but didn't. He went to Abu Bakr. I don't think Abu Bakr freed him. So this great guy, this model of slave, even if Bilal had been freed and given chocolate cakes every day of his life, so what? The Islamic system was a system of grinding slavery for vast numbers of human beings. Remember what I was quoting you? That was a Muslim writer, Jonathan A.C. Brown, not a Christian writer. So, Let's continue.
Right, you see, they're fuming inside, they know it. Let me speak. Right, so what he did, he bought slaves. He bought slaves for the purpose of selling them. No, man. Listen, listen to me. You don't worry about it. We'll come on to that. Jesus, there's only three, what you call, there's only three ministry that he had.
Okay, so that's really that. I'll just show you some pictures to show that how little involvement Islam had in the slave trade. This picture here is Islamic slave traders caught by the British, the beginning of the 20th century, or the late 19th century. Here, I'll get that without it. Where is it? Yep, these are black slaves owned by Arabs. Let's see what it says. Newly released slaves pose with two British sailors who are in the background in Zanzibar, which has set a major slave market for the Muslims, before they return to their homelands. These guys are three slavers, Muslim slavers that had been caught by the British and were in chains. And here we've got a representation of a British assault on a Muslim slave market. So 3 cheers for the British Empire. We can't let Muslims get away with this. And of course, they don't, provided people are on the ball. And so, I hope that an understanding amongst black people and apologists really does deepen about this. Very important. Some Muslims are shysters and they'll tell you anything. It's called taqiyya, that's right, isn't it? Everybody knows taqiyya. Alright, taqiyya's been blown today. Now, final thing is to show that this is not just a matter of business, getting black people, making them slaves, making them work, and so on. It's actually got a racial component. Islam is a racist religion. As I said, its founder was calling black people raisin heads, and you do not call the Prophet black, otherwise you're in big trouble. But here, in Jonathan Brown's book, we've got this heading, Blackness and Slavery in Islamic Civilization. He says, as we discussed briefly in the introduction, racial discrimination and racial stereotypes have long existed in Islamic civilization and among Muslims. Chief among these is the conception of blackness as a deficiency and its association with slavery, as we still see with the habit in some parts of the Arab world of referring to black people as slaves. Let's see if there's anything else which we can pick up on. We have here numerous scholars of Islamic history and slavery more broadly have pointed out the association of blackness and slavery in Islamic civilization, as well as the use of blackness to justify enslavement. And then he talks about a possible forged hadith, which was negative about black people. But I think we've got the point across that there's no redeeming feature for black people in Islam. And if you know what's going on in Libya today, they've picked up slavery as soon as there was no longer a force to stop them. Now there's a further along in this book, I won't scroll down to it. The question is, what about the present? What about the future? Is slavery gone from Islam? Well, he's got a chart which shows all the major events leading to the abolition of slavery, all the things that were done, they're all done by Europeans. Obviously the British Empire, extremely important in this, but resistance by Muslim leaders. Talking about the Ottomans saying, we don't have to stop slavery, leave us alone. They just don't understand why it should be stopped. And they're not the only ones. Mauritania only abolished slavery in 1981. So really, 1980 maybe, I may be being a bit unfair. And some Muslims like to say, progressives, oh well, slavery's gone now, that's it. But more conservative Muslims say, look, Sharia enshrines slavery, therefore there may be, if conditions change, slavery could be brought back. Now I don't say in principle slavery as a natural evil, because it's there in the Old Testament, it's there in human civilization, it's a social relation, but once it's gone, you don't want it brought back. It's an inferior social relation, so once you transcend it, you don't go back to it. Like a dog shouldn't return to its vomit, but it does, but we're not dogs. Well, these Muslims, scholars, are saying that it's a possibility to go back to slavery. Jonathan Brown doesn't like that idea. He kind of poo-poos it, but he doesn't really give a good, solid justification for that. Just that he doesn't really strongly justify justify his criticism of ISIS when they instituted slavery and sexual slavery against Yazidi girls. ISIS were able to justify on the basis of ancient Islamic teaching that this was perfectly proper. And if anyone wants to kind of be away with the fairies, pretending that everything's all right now in Islam as far as slavery goes, well, wait until Western power goes into a proper decline. Just wait. If we do provoke the Russians enough, and so we're completely devastated over in Africa and the Middle East, they'll be up to those tricks again. This time there'll be no British men of war to patrol the coast to bring it to an end. It will flourish. Best not to let that happen. Best not to be so naive as to let that happen.